Rompin' round the Wind River Range. This trip explored the Wind River Range, southeast of Yellowstone and Grand Teton National Parks. The winds cover 2,800 square miles of terrain in the Bridger-Teton National Forest and serve as a habitat to similar species as the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Our original plan had us fly into Boise and spend 7 nights in the Sawtooth Mountain Range in Idaho, but the forest was burny, so we drove 7 hours east to the Bridger Wilderness in the Wind River Range of Wyoming, quickly mapping out a new week-long route. Luckily, most of our group had some experience in this mountain range and ideas about some highlights to try to see. We spoke with the local gearheads at a mountaineering shop in Pinedale and devised a rough plan for our week in the wilderness. Day 1 was about 13 2/3 miles. We had about 2,500 feet of up, 1,700 feet of loss over 2 sustained climbs and 1 descent, ending at Upper Cook Lakes. We drove north from Pinedale and started our hike at the Elkhart Trailhead and traversed the Pole Creek Trail to start. We started in the Bridger-Teton National Forest before officially entering the Wind River Range.
Close to 4 miles in on the hike here, and we're in the Wind River Range. Nice little meadow, headed off to the mountains over that way. About 10 miles for the day, so a little bit more climbing. Continue up to Cook's Lake. Here we go.
Since we hadn't mapped out a route to follow long before arrival, there was a bit more wayfinding on this trip compared to most. Our first stop was at Photographer's Point. Day 1 featured quite a bit of meadow hiking as well, which was enjoyable. We stopped for lunch at one of the many ponds along Pole Creek.
About 10 miles in, today we're doing somewhere around 13, and just had to do a little creek crossing here. A little bit slippery, a little bit wet. Gonna recoup from this, head out for the last section of the day. We've done about 1,500 up, about 1,000 down. A little bit more of both to come.
We had a good variety of creek crossings this trip. Some dicey, some not so much. Regardless, it's always nice to have extra water sources at hand. We made it to Upper Cook Lakes, where we settled in for the night. We were lucky to get views of a stereotypical alpine lake on day 1, just a day hike away from a trailhead. We found some refuge from the wind among some of the shrubs at the Upper Cook Lakes for the night. Daytime temperatures averaged around 65 degrees. At night, it got down into the upper 30s. Day 2 continued to have a lot of enjoyable hiking over rolling hills. It was about 12 1/3 miles overall. We broke camp from Upper Cook Lakes and ended at Victor Lake. All in all, it was about 2,500 feet of gain and 2,900 feet of loss. Beautiful hiking, especially in the morning. Early morning on day 2, we got our first precipitation of the trip. At 6:35 a.m., a loud thunder felt like it was just above where we had our tents set up. We got to experience the infamous thunder snow. We delayed our morning start by about 2.5 hours to let the storm pass, as we constantly had to shake off the snow from our tents. It's crazy what a stark contrast just 12 hours in the mountains can make.
Had some serious thunder snow last night. 3 tent mates over here. But man, to see these evergreens covered in snow in August is an unsurprising treat.
Even though it was just about 3 inches of snow, it significantly slowed our pace as well. Again, another curveball thrown in our trip. Lakes with their fresh white borders were extra stunning, and there were plenty, as there are over 1,300 in the Bridger Wilderness alone.
A nice wet snowy creek crossing here. Doing our best to take it easy. Beautiful morning. Beautiful morning starting off this hike on day 2.
The snow made for some wet hiking to start the day that quickly melted as the day went on. We stopped for breakfast amidst a small climb and aired out some of our damp gear. The morning hike ended up being quite picturesque, as the snow was being sopped up by the arid ground. We didn't bump into too much wildlife on this trip, but did come across a family of sage grouse. We got reinvigorated for the last push of the day by airing out our wet feet and gear and soaking in some sun at lunch. The vast majority of day 2 was actually spent going north to south on the Continental Divide Trail.
Just made it to the top of this pass. Highest point that we'll be on for the end of day 2. A little bit of down left. About 1,000 feet drop. A couple more miles. In a nice valley, and it looks like most of the snow is melting, so hoping for some dry ground.
We kept on trekking, and the trail progressively got drier and drier. Even with the late start in the morning, we were able to get to Victor Lake before sunset and explored the peninsula where we had supper under the stars. Victor Lake had quite a few contours around the edges and many small islands. In an average Midwestern setting, it would be worth spending a weekend at, but we unfortunately only had a few hours to enjoy here. Day 2 temperatures during the day averaged 53, and at night got down to 35. On day 3 we had a few more punchy climbs, and we're at higher elevation. We also started to go off trail about halfway through the day. Ended up being about 12 2/3 miles with 3,600 feet of gain and 2,700 feet of loss. We ended up at a beautiful campsite in Alpine Basin. No snow this morning, but there was a special type of frost that stuck like glue to our tents, unlike anything I had experienced before. It was chilly enough to form ice crystals in some of the creek pockets as well.
Started off day 3 decently early, about 7:15. Early enough for the steam to be coming off the lakes here.
A faint trail through the frozen tundra made for easy cruising miles in the morning. At 6 miles into our hike, we had a windy breakfast atop Hay Pass near 11,000 feet, where we again tried to dry out our gear from the frosty night while overlooking Dennis Lake. We had enjoyable hiking along Golden Lake, Lake Louise, and Upper Golden Lake before departing from the defined trail and starting our off-trail adventure, navigating the mountains.
Found a patch of blueberries right along the edge of this lake here. And I'm not gonna pass that up. Pass number 2 of the day. This one a little bit tougher, steeper, more of a bugger. Good views of where we came from on the other side of these lakes over there.
Shortly after starting our off-trail experience, we figured out how challenging navigating this mountain range was, getting walled out immediately and having to backtrack 300 feet back down the mountain after our first climb. We stopped for lunch at the base of Douglas Peak before a treacherous 800-foot ascent where we would reach an altitude of 11,600 feet.
This attempt is extremely steep, off-trail, all scree boulders, nearly impossible, near the top, and it goes straight up to heaven. See you on the other side.
The other side being an extremely rewarding view of Alpine Lakes Basin, where its remoteness matched its beauty. We now just had to descend down to camp. After 4 hours of rock hopping, we had to scrounge for space that was as flat as possible amongst this wild and rugged terrain. Many of the campsites here were true alpine basins, bowl-shaped valleys encompassed by mountains on all sides, with a glacial lake serving as the center point. The aptly named Alpine Basin was a gorgeous harbinger of what we would expect our upcoming miles and next couple of campsites to look like. We spent the night at the base of a peninsula on the first of 3 lakes in the Alpine Basin in preparation to start our off-trail climb in the morning. Day 3 daytime temperatures were 60 to 70 degrees depending on the altitude, and at night got down to 42. On day 4, we continued our off-trail journey. Despite being shorter in mileage, these miles are by far more treacherous on the body. We topped out over 2 passes at 12,000 feet of altitude before gaining a trail on our last descent into camp at Indian Basin. We had about 3,700 feet of gain and 3,600 feet of loss for the day. We got an early start for another long, tough day off trail as we hiked through the rest of the Alpine Basin lakes. Apologize in advance here as much of the day was quite windy.
Alright, starting day 4, and we beat the sun out of the canyon. So got some shaded hiking here and working up towards this pass. Pass number 1 of the day, off trail. Gonna be a long ankle twisting day, but we'll get through.
Again, water was not an issue as there was a plethora of glacial runoff amidst the boulders.
Just topping off on the first pass of day 4 where we came from, and the windy area of the jagged rocks of where we're going of the Wind River Range.
The first pass appeared to be a false pass, so we ended up devouring some breakfast on the way up our first legitimate pass of the day, seen here. One last look at Alpine Basin, where we saw shifting winds and whitecaps on the water. We topped out the saddle and luckily got off this jagged scree field.
The other side of Pass 1. Very different weather over here. Looks like it might spit on us a little bit. A little bit more packed gravel though, so thankful for that. Windy beyond all get out, but we're headed this way toward Knife Point Glacier and going to make our way around it and up towards Indian Pass up there. Woo! Starting the climb on pass number 2 of the day, and we got plenty of water to start off, and we heading around this way.
Snowfield crossings are always a little slick, but no problem for us. We were able to gain a faint trail on the other side of Indian Pass, but we certainly had to earn it amongst the boulder fields and wind. On the other side of the pass, we were lucky enough to finally pick up a trail again. I can't emphasize enough just how grueling this was being off trail on rocky terrain, devising a self-guided route throughout this mountain range. It impacted our muscles, joints, and gear. We found a sliver of shade just off the trail and had lunch. A bit hard to see, but even just 8 miles of this off-angled granite can chew up the foam on these shoes like none other. 100 miles in total on these shoes. These shoes used for just road running and treadmill running without any foam deficiencies have seen over 200 miles longer than the distance of the Appalachian Trail. It was hard not to salivate at the sight of Indian Basin. The campsites just kept getting more and more stunning each night. I set up my cozy little tent, and the 3 daring members of the group decided to sleep under the stars without a rainfly this night. Hard to blame them being surrounded by such an inspiring landscape. We took in the sunset and sat mesmerized by the 12,000-foot peak just across the lake. Camp at Indian Basin was rugged, just like the mountains that towered over us that night. The alpenglow here was special, likely the best of the trip. Day 4 temps averaged in the mid-60s, and at night got down to 35. The hike on day 5 was quick and easy as we scooched over from one mountainside to the other, going from Indian Basin to Titcomb Basin, where we enjoyed some free time. Just over 5 miles, 400 feet of gain, and under 1,000 feet of loss. Since we had a short 5-mile hike on tap that day, we spent extra time eating breakfast in our awestruck stupor in Indian Basin. Despite driving 7 hours one way to get away from what at the time was a 35,000-acre wildfire in Idaho, smaller wildfires remained active near the Wind River Range, as we woke up to haze on the morning of day 5 in Indian Basin. Given our short itinerary for the day, our early arrival into Titcomb Basin earned us our choice of campsites along the 2 main lakes.
Lake number 2 in the Titcomb Basin. And now just hanging out, walking over to my 3 amigos on the peninsula, and gonna try our hand out at some fishing. I'll have a little bit of lunch there. I already took a little bath in the water, nice and chilly, and hopefully they will too.
Luckily, the haze remained mild. There wasn't a bad view from any angle from our home for the day. We found flat ground on the west side between the 2 lakes and Titcomb Basin. Being surrounded on both sides by prolonged peaks above us meant that it had the potential to create a wind tunnel-like effect. but luckily we were spared that night. There wasn't a bad view from any angle here. Daytime temps were in the mid-50s, and at night it got down to 38. On the morning of day 6, we explored the northern mountainsides in Titcomb Basin, along with a stop at Summer Ice Lake, before departing camp and cruising over to Seneca Lake on a relatively flat trail. 12 3/4 miles in total, 2,100 feet of gain, and 2,500 feet of loss. We took our light day packs out to do some local exploring to start day 6. Being sandwiched between multiple 13,000-foot behemoths made it obvious why Titcomb Basin is considered the most beautiful spot in the 2,800 square miles of the Wind River Range. Venturing north got us a viewpoint of all the lakes in the basin where we enjoyed our oatmeal. Doing a little off-trail work here on day 6, heading up into this valley of multiple mountains surrounding us. Doing a little climbing this morning. Sun just about to peak over us. Beautiful day. A little smoky, a little hazy. Looking back at where we came from. Summer Ice Lake, aptly named due to the supply of water that it gets from all this glacial activity surrounding it. Quite chilly water. Summer Ice Lakes was built right into the side of Henderson Peak. On the backside of where we sat, continued a steep grade down the mountainside, similar to an infinity pool if the water were to run off. I grabbed a couple quartz crystals as mementos there. More on those later. We made our way back to break camp and start our full-on hike for the day. It was tough to leave Titcomb Basin being the gem of the winds, but we didn't want to risk worse air quality potentially coming in. We continued southward on our buttery smooth path, crossing the Continental Divide Trail before eventually arriving at camp on Seneca Lake. Again, early bird got the worm with choice of campsites and fishing spots too. Camp was propped up on a cliff overlooking Seneca Lake, which was just begging us to take in the sights for one last night. Our original Idaho trip itinerary was devised to nearly guarantee fish each night. Not knowing the fish population of the lakes we were staying at in Wyoming didn't stop Grant and Garsky's determination to avoid us getting skunked. And alas, we finally enjoyed fish stew on our last night in the winds. I couldn't dream up of a cooler location to camp at Seneca Lake from our overlook on the cliff. We had the best of both worlds. The view of a lighthouse and also protection from some of the conifers that started to pop up now that we were at a bit lower elevation. Not far from our fishing spots and just off the trail. Day 6 daytime temps were in the upper 60s, and nighttime temps only got down to 46. We left our campsite overlooking Seneca Lake and had a 9.5-mile downhill hike out to earn our first real food in a week. Light packs and thoughts of a home-cooked meal kept the pace and motivation in high gear, Under 1,000 feet of gain, just under 2,000 feet of loss for the day. We woke to another dry, pleasant morning, now at lower elevation. The hiking was enjoyable, being smooth rolling inclines and declines on the trip, which always ends up being a bit easier on the body and mind. There were plenty of small lakes on our way out as well. Eventually, we stopped at one for our last breakfast, and we had to try our hand at fishing too.
Bigger than the fish?
We wrapped up by retracing a couple miles from our entry into the winds on day one, and eventually had to bid adieu to the Bridger Wilderness and Wind River Range. We left with an immense appreciation for this beautiful wilderness and brought back a couple mementos for our fish tank. Yay! Where do we get it from?